Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
Today, we are really digging into one of the most foundational, I would say, load-bearing narratives in American history. We're looking at the mechanism of Thanksgiving.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about the holiday itself, not the menu, not the travel plan.
No, not at all. We are talking about the machinery of history, how a specific event gets remembered, maybe more importantly, how it's forgotten.
And what that selective memory actually does, what function it serves for the nation that holds it.
Exactly. And we're doing this deep dive through the lens of a phenomenal book by David J. Silverman, This Land is Their Land.
I have to say, reading this, for me, it was a complete paradigm shift. I mean, you grow up with this sort of pageant in your head, right?
Yeah. The buckles and the hats.
The buckles, the turkeys, the friendly handshake across the table. It's this perfect picture of harmony.
But Silverman's entire point is that this picture isn't history, it's something else. He calls it a narrative compression.
That's the perfect term for it. Narrative compression.
It is. It takes what was actually a 50-year saga of, geopolitics, plague, brutal warfare, and enslavement.
50 years.
And it squeezes it all down into a single afternoon of eating together.
And that compression, that simplification, it isn't an accident. It's not just a fuzzy memory. It serves a very specific structural function.
It stabilizes the entire national origin story.
Right. It transforms the story about a violent collision of two very different systems into a story about a dinner party.
And so that's our job today. We want to unpack that collision. We're going to look at the system design, we're going to look at the incentives driving the actors, and we're going to look at the outcomes.
Because when you really look at the Wampanoag and the English in the 17th century, you're not seeing good guys and bad guys. That's the wrong frame.
It's a useless frame. What you're seeing are two distinct political systems, each with its own logic, its own rules.
Crashing into each other?
Exactly. And to understand the crash, we have to understand the systems as they existed before contact. So let's start there. Let's do our system orientation.
Okay, so let's start with the Wampanoag. Because the biggest misconception, and I will absolutely put my hand up here, I had this idea before digging into the book, is this concept of the wilderness.
The primeval forest.
Yeah, you imagine the Mayflower showing up to this dense, dark, tangled forest that nobody's ever touched. But Silverman makes it so clear. Wampanoag country was not a wilderness.
It was a garden, a carefully managed park almost.
That's the first huge perception shift we have to make. I mean, if you were an Englishman walking through the forests of Patuxent, the place that would become Plymouth in, say, 1610.
You wouldn't be hacking through vines with a machete. You would be walking through a landscape that felt, to European eyes, almost unnaturally open.
The primary sources describe it as being open enough that you could ride a horse through it at a full gallop.
And that wasn't an accident of nature. That was technology.
Pyrotechnology, as Silverman puts it.
Yes. The Wampanoags practiced controlled burns. It was a highly sophisticated land management system. Twice a year, usually in the spring and fall, they would set fire to the underbrush.
And this did a few things, right? It wasn't just about clearing space.
Oh, it was a multi-tool. First, it kills pests, ticks, fleas, other things you don't want around your village. Second, it encourages the growth of berries and tubers that need sunlight to thrive.
So it's enriching the soil and promoting certain food sources.
Exactly. And crucially, it creates sightlines. It clears out the dense brush so you can actually see the deer and other game you're trying to hunt. It made the whole forest more productive.
It effectively turned the entire landscape into a kind of game preserve. It's just a completely different system from the European model of, fencing everything off and farming in neat little squares.
But it's just as intensive, just as deliberate. And this idea of a structured, managed world extends to their political system, too. I was really struck by the complexity of the sachamship.
This is where the translation just completely fails us, right? We hear the word chief or king.
And we immediately project this European idea of an absolute monarch. Someone sitting on a throne, barking out orders that everyone has to obey.
But the Wampanoag system was nothing like that. It was, if anything, more democratic. It was consensus-based.
That's the key. Think of it like a modern parliamentary coalition. You had dozens of local sachems, leaders of individual villages managing their own internal affairs.
And then you had the paramount sachem.
Yeah.
In this case, Usamakon, who we usually know from the Thanksgiving story as Massasoit.
Right. But Usamakon couldn't just issue a decree and say, we're going to war, end of discussion. He had to politic, he had to persuade, he had to convince all those local sachems that his plan was the best one.
And if he didn't?
His power was based on his ability to build that consensus and really to distribute resources effectively. If a sachem became a tyrant or just ineffective, his people would literally vote with their feet.
They'd just pack up and move to another sachem's village.
Exactly. So Usmaken was constantly in this mode of negotiation, of diplomacy. And he wasn't doing it alone. He had, for lack of a better term, a cabinet.
The Nisiosok.
The Nisiosok. This is such a fascinating part of their social structure. These were not just advisors.
No, the book describes them as a warrior counselor elite.
That's a great way to put it. To become one, you had to go through this incredibly rigorous training. It sounds like something out of, I don't know, modern special forces selection mixed with a monastic retreat.
Silverman describes them drinking these bitter herbal juices until they vomited, to purge themselves spiritually and physically.
And going out into the winter frost with almost no clothing to prove their endurance, their mental and physical toughness.
These were men who had mastered their own bodies so they could protect the body politic.
And they served as the sachem's personal bodyguard, his top generals in wartime, and his moral compass. So when we talk about Usmaken, we're not talking about some savage in the woods.
No, we're talking about the head of a complex, stratified, deliberative government that managed its resources and its defense with a very high level of sophistication.
And it was a society that was deeply historical. That's another thing the wilderness myth erases, this idea that indigenous people just lived in this sort of timeless, unchanging present.
But the land itself was their archive.
The memory hole.
Yeah, these physical spots in the ground. Tell us about those.
This is a beautiful example of how a non-literate society, meaning a society without a written alphabet, maintains a high-fidelity historical record.
A way to store data.
Exactly. Throughout Wampanoag territory, there were these specific pits or depressions dug into the earth. And the rule was, every time you walked past one of these memory holes, you had to stop.
You had to physically interact with it.
You had to clear out any leaves or debris that had fallen in. And as you did that, you had to retell the story associated with that specific spot on the earth.
It's a mnemonic device. The land itself is the trigger for the history. Here is where the great peace was made. Here is where the battle was fought.
The landscape becomes a living library. Every rock, every stream has a story.
So into this managed, governed, historically rich system
Comes a destabilizing variable, the Europeans. And initially, the Wampanoags don't view them as settlers or colonizers. That framework doesn't exist yet.
they see them as a curiosity and, pretty quickly, a nuisance.
The walking islands. That's such a vivid image for how the big European ships must have looked appearing on the horizon.
But the early interactions, they weren't the friendly welcome to our land scenes we see in the paintings. They were confusing, they were often violent, and they were very transactional.
There's a story Silverman recounts that just perfectly captures this crisis in perception between the two cultures. It's the Hoggery incident.
I love this story because it's sort of funny on the surface, but it's also incredibly revealing about the clash of values.
It is. So you have a European ship that's anchored off the coast to trade. The sailors are, tense. They're thousands of miles from home. They're heavily armed.
Standard operating procedure.
And the Wampanoags are paddling out in their canoes, bringing furs or corn to trade. And at some point, something goes wrong. A gesture is misinterpreted. A sailor gets jumpy. The sailors open fire with their muskets.
Also, sadly, standard operating procedure for early contact.
Right. And as the Wampanoags are paddling away, escaping the gunfire, they turn back and they start shouting at the ship. They're screaming, "Hoggery! Hoggery!"
Which the English sailors probably just heard as some kind of war cry or a curse.
Of course. But later linguistic analysis suggests they were actually using a pidgin English word they had already picked up from other traders. They were calling the sailors hogs.
Which isn't just a random insult. It's a very specific moral judgment.
It is. In the Wampanoag system, a hog was a creature that consumed everything, shared nothing, and had no social grace. Pigs were these nasty animals the Europeans kept that just rooted around in the dirt and bit people.
They lacked reciprocity.
They lacked reciprocity. So when the Wampanoags saw these Europeans hoarding goods, refusing to engage in the proper rituals of trade, and then reacting with a disproportionate violence, they didn't see a superior civilization.
They saw pigs, they saw hoggery.
So that's our baseline. We have this sophisticated Wampanoag system, and you have this European system that, to the locals, looks like aggression and just plain bad manners.
Which brings us to the central mystery of the book. How do we get from hoggery and shooting to the Thanksgiving feast. How on earth do we get from that conflict to the famous alliance of 1621?
And this is where we have to shift our analysis to the core system design and look at it through the lens of catastrophe. Because that alliance did not happen because Usamakeen suddenly had a change of heart and decided to be nice.
It happened because his entire world ended.
We are talking about the Great Dying, the epidemiological collapse.
We really need to pause on the scale of this. Between 1616 and 1619, so this is just 1 year before the Mayflower even shows up, a plague sweeps down the coast of New England.
The latest thinking is that it was likely leptospirosis, a bacterial disease spread by the urine of rats from European ships, which got into the water supply. But the specific pathogen matters less than the outcome.
The mortality rate was estimated at 90%.
90%. Let's just try to visualize that for a second. Imagine your neighborhood. Imagine every single house on your street. Now imagine that in 9 out of 10 of those houses, every single person is dead.
The survivors would be too few and too weak to even bury the bodies.
The sources describe the English arriving and finding skulls and bones littering the ground. The dead were just left rotting in the wigwams. The silence on the coast must have been deafening.
And it's not just the sheer number of deaths, it's who died. Silverman makes the point that this wasn't just a demographic loss, it was a structural decapitation of the society.
Exactly. In an oral culture, who holds the knowledge? The elders. They are the libraries. They are the Supreme Court justices. They're the encyclopedias. When they die, that knowledge just vanishes instantly.
The memory holes are still there, but there's no one left to tell the stories.
And then you have the Pawas, the spiritual leaders, the healers. They died in huge numbers because they were the ones on the front lines tending to the sick.
Which would have created this massive spiritual crisis. I mean, if you're Wampanoag in 1619 and you see your most powerful healers dying and your most sacred prayers aren't working, what does that tell you about your cosmos?
It tells you that your spiritual system has failed. Or, even worse, that the enemy's spiritual system, the Christian God, is stronger. It created deep spiritual vulnerability that hadn't existed before.
And on top of all that, it was a geopolitical disaster.
A total disaster. The plague was weirdly selective. It absolutely ravaged the Wampanoags and other coastal groups, but for some reason it stopped right at the border of Narragansett Bay.
So the Narragansetts, the Wampanoags' main rivals to the west, were largely untouched.
They were at full strength. So now, you're Usamakeen. You are the leader of a shattered, grieving, traumatized people. You've lost 90% of your population. Your spiritual world is in chaos. And right next door, the Narragansetts are looking at your depopulated lands and thinking, this is our chance. We can finally subjugate the Wampanoags and turn them into a tributary state.
So this is the context. This sets the stage for the alliance. This is the incentive part of our framework. Usamakeen doesn't reach out to the Pilgrims because he's friendly or naive.
He reaches out because he has a gun to his head, metaphorically and literally. The Narragansetts are the gun.
It's pure, desperate realpolitik. He sees this pathetic little group of English people who are starving, dying of scurvy, struggling to build even the most basic shelters, and he makes a strategic calculation.
He thinks these people are weak, pathetically weak. But they have something I desperately need.
Guns. And even though those early muskets were wildly inaccurate and took forever to reload,
They made a lot of noise. They were a psychological weapon. They were a deterrent.
so Usamakeen's strategy is what Silverman calls great man, little child. And this is such a critical inversion of the traditional Thanksgiving myth.
It completely flips it on its head. We usually think of the Pilgrims as the strong, great fathers, bringing civilization to the helpless children of the forest.
But Usamakeen saw it the other way around. He saw himself as the great man.
He looked at the English and saw children. They couldn't feed themselves. They didn't know how to plant corn. They got lost in the woods. They died of exposure. They were helpless.
He viewed them as a dependent protectorate.
Exactly. His thinking was, I will be the patron. I will feed these children. I will protect them. I will let them live on my land. And in exchange, their guns will be my weapon. They will be a wall to me from my bloody enemies.
He thought he could manage them. He thought he could just incorporate this tiny English village into the existing Wampanoag political system as another tributary group under his control.
And for a while, it actually worked. That's the thing. The first Thanksgiving in 1621, it wasn't a myth in the sense that it didn't happen. They did eat together.
But the context was everything. It wasn't a potluck. It was a state dinner. It was a political summit to ratify this new military alliance.
You don't invite your enemies to a state dinner, but you also don't necessarily invite your best friends. You invite the people you need to impress and bind to you through obligations of reciprocity.
And the Wampanoag showed up with 90 men.
90 men. That's not just bringing a few friends along. That was a show of force. They were saying, we are allies, but don't you ever forget who is the senior partner in this alliance. We have the warriors.
And the lubricant for this whole system was trade. We have to talk about the role of stuff. Because the Wampanoags weren't just interested in guns. They wanted copper kettles, glass beads, steel knives.
This gets back to the internal incentive structure of Wampanoag society. Sachem maintained his power and prestige by giving gifts to his followers.
Right. It's the potlatch model. Generosity equals status.
So if you, as a sachem, could get your hands on rare, exotic, technologically superior items, like a copper kettle you could cut up into dazzling jewelry, or a steel blade that never lost its edge, your status skyrocketed.
So Ulsamakin used the English as a kind of prestige good factory. It helped him solve his external security problem with the Narragansetts, while also solidifying his internal political control over his own people.
So for a brief moment, you have a system that is functional. It's a mutual defense pact based on mutual need. The English get corn and survival, the Wampanoags get protection and prestige goods.
But systems are not static. They change. And this brings us to the great system rupture.
The rupture happens because the core variables of the system shifted, and the single most important variable was demographics.
In 1620, the English had this tiny huddled group of about 50 survivors. But then comes the Great Migration of the 1630s and 40s.
The Puritans, not hundreds, but tens of thousands of them.
They pour into the newly founded Massachusetts Bay Colony just to the north, and suddenly the English aren't a little child anymore.
No, the child has grown up, and it's getting big, very big. And at the exact same time, the Wampanoag population is either stagnant or declining because of recurring outbreaks of European diseases.
And with this population boom comes a fundamental economic shift. The old frontier exchange economy, trading furs for kettles, starts to die out. And there's a simple reason for that.
They killed all the beavers.
Basically, yeah. The ecological limit of the fur trade in that region was reached very quickly.
And once the fur trade declined, the English had very little economic use for the Wampanoags as hunters or trading partners, but they had a desperate, growing need for the one thing the Wampanoags still possessed in abundance.
Their land.
The land itself. This is the shift to the agrarian land economy, and this is where the conflict becomes structural and in many ways inevitable.
Because the entire English way of life, their model of farming, raising livestock, it was incredibly land-hungry.
And this is where we have to talk about the cows. We mentioned earlier that livestock was a weapon. I want to really deep dive on this because it's a perfect example of systems thinking. We tend to think of colonization as men with guns.
But Silverman argues that the cow, or the hog, was just as destructive as the musket.
They were the shock troopers of colonization. The English practiced what was called free-range husbandry. They didn't build fences to keep their animals in. They just let them roam free through the woods.
So you'd have hundreds of English-owned hogs and cattle just wandering around. And where would they inevitably go?
To the single best source of food in the area, the unfenced Wampanoag cornfields.
Because the Wampanoags had no reason to fence their fields. They didn't have any domestic grazing animals of their own to keep out.
Exactly. So the English cows and pigs would wander into a Wampanoag village, trample the corn, eat the beans, destroy their winter food supply. And when the Wampanoags would complain to the English authorities in Plymouth,
the English courts would say, well, under English law, it's the responsibility of the farmer to protect his crops. You should have built a fence.
If you didn't build a fence, it's your fault your corn got eaten.
That is a brilliant and absolutely evil catch-22.
It is, because to build a European-style fence requires a massive amount of labor the Wampanoags don't have, because 90% of their people died. And it requires accepting the entire English legal premise of private enclosed property.
It forces a constitutional change on Wampanoag society. It forces them to start acting like Englishmen just to protect their lunch.
And what if they killed one of the cows that was eating their corn?
Then the English would drag them into an English court and fine them heavily for destroying English property.
This brings us to the other pincer of the system. It wasn't just economic pressure, it was judicial warfare. The English systematically used their courts to dismantle Wampanoag sovereignty piece by piece.
This is so important. It wasn't always a shootout in the woods. Very often it was a lawsuit in a courtroom. The English just unilaterally extended their legal jurisdiction over the Wampanoags.
They started fining sachems for misconduct. They started demanding that Wampanoags answer to English magistrates for disputes between themselves. They treated sovereign leaders like subjects of the English king.
And this leads directly to what Silverman calls the deed game. I found this part of the book just infuriating to read about. It's such a modern-sounding scam.
It's a land fraud scheme, plain and simple. The English hunger for land was insatiable, but they maintained this legal fiction that they had to buy it to make the title legitimate.
So they developed a tactic.
They would find a marginalized Wampanoag individual, someone with no real authority in their own community, maybe someone who had fallen into debt to an English trader for alcohol or goods.
They'd get him drunk or threaten him with jail for his debts.
And then they would say, look, we'll forgive your entire debt if you just put your mark on this piece of paper. And that piece of paper was a deed signing away a massive tract of tribal land.
Land that this one individual had absolutely no right to sell.
Of course not. In the Wampanoag system, land was held collectively by the community. A single person couldn't sell it any more than you and I could sell Central Park.
But once that paper was signed, the English treated it as a legally binding contract.
They would take that fraudulent deed to the Plymouth court. The court would validate it. And then, if the paramount Sachem Usamukin, or later his sons, tried to stop the English from settling on that land, the English would say,
"We have a legal document. You are violating our property rights."
it weaponized their legal system to launder theft into legitimate commerce.
And this pressure cooker just keeps building and building. You have the cows eating the corn. You have the courts stripping away their sovereignty. You have the deeds stealing the land base from under their feet.
And then you have the inevitable generational shift. Usimaquin, the great strategist who forged the original alliance, he dies. His son Wamsutta takes over as paramount sachem.
Wamsutta tries to maintain the alliance, but he's not willing to be a doormat. He's from a new generation. He sees what's happening.
He tries to play a more assertive diplomatic game. He starts selling some land to other colonies like Rhode Island to try and play them off against Plymouth. He's trying to maintain some semblance of his people's independence.
And Plymouth decides they've had enough of this uppity sachem.
This is the moment the little child fully turns on the great man. Josiah Winslow, who is the son of the original Pilgrim leader Edward Winslow, Usimaquin's old friend, he takes a squad of armed men, marches into Wamsutta's lodge,
And arrests the sovereign leader of the Wampanoag Nation at gunpoint in his own home.
he drags him to Plymouth for interrogation.
And very shortly after, Wamsutta falls ill and dies.
The Wampanoags were absolutely convinced he was poisoned. And whether he was physically poisoned or not, the message was crystal clear.
The message was, you are not our allies anymore. You are our subjects, and we can kill your leaders with impunity.
And this leaves Wamsutta's younger brother, Kumetakam, who is known to history as King Philip in charge. And he knows, looking at what happened to his brother, that diplomacy is dead. The system of alliance is broken.
He spends the next several years secretly building a pan-tribal coalition. He goes to the Narragansetts, the Nipmuc's tribes that have been enemies of the Wampanoags for generations.
And he makes the case. He says, look at what they're doing. If we don't unite and fight back now, they will swallow us all, one by one.
And in 1675, the system finally ruptures. King Philip's War begins. And we need to convey the scale of this because it's so often treated as a minor skirmish in the history books.
It was an apocalypse for New England. In terms of the percentage of the population killed on both sides, it was the single bloodiest war in American history.
More violent per capita than the Civil War. More violent than World War II.
52 English towns were attacked. 25 of them were burned to the ground. The Native coalition pushed the English line of settlement back almost to the coast. For a while, it looked like they might actually drive the English out of New England entirely.
It was a total war for survival.
But in the end, the English had the numbers, they had deeper supply lines, and they waged a brutal war of attrition. They burned the Wampanoag cornfields, targeted non-combatants, and eventually ground the resistance down.
And the end of the war brings us to one of the darkest interconnections in our entire analysis, the direct connection between Puritan New England and the sugar plantations of the Caribbean.
The slavery connection. This was something reading the book that I had never really learned. We associate chattel slavery with the South, with cotton and tobacco. We don't associate it with the Pilgrims.
But we absolutely should. At the end of the war, the English colonies had hundreds, maybe thousands, of Wampanoag prisoners of war. Men, women, and children.
And they had a problem. What do you do with them? They didn't want to just release them because they might fight again, but executing all of them seemed well, wasteful. It was bad business.
So they commodified them? They turned human beings into capital.
They packed them onto ships and sold them into the brutal, life-destroying sugar plantation system in places like Barbados, Jamaica, and Bermuda.
So the descendants of the very people who fed the starving Mayflower survivors 50 years earlier were sold into slavery.
And the economics of this are just chilling. The English colonies traded these human beings for sugar, molasses, and rum.
Think about that feedback loop. The wealth of early New England, the capital that built the merchant houses in Boston, that funded Harvard University, was built in part by exchanging the indigenous population for tropical luxury goods.
It connects the Thanksgiving story directly and explicitly to the global Atlantic slave trade.
And for the Wampanoags who weren't shipped away, for those who remained in New England, they weren't free either.
No. The English created a system of what you could call judicial enslavement or long-term indenture. They would take Wampanoag children, declare them wards of the state, and bind them out to English families as servants.
Ostensibly until they were adults, right? Age 24 or 30.
Right, but there was a cruel loophole. If that indentured servant had a child of their own during their servitude, the clock started over for the baby. It created a system of heritable, multi-generational servitude.
It was a mechanism to breed the culture out of them. If you raise a Wampanoag child in an English house, forbidding them to speak their language, forcing them to go to church, you erase the Indian.
It was a policy of cultural genocide masked as benevolent guardianship. And yet this entire horrific 50-year slide, from the plague to the alliance of desperation to the betrayal, the war, the enslavement, is almost completely absent from the national consciousness.
Instead, we have the turkey. We have the buckle hats.
We have the compression. And this is where we need to look at the present-day structural relevance. How was this myth actually constructed? Because, as we said, nobody in 1621 thought they were having the first Thanksgiving.
No, Edward Winslow wrote a few lines about a harvest feast in a letter back to England, and then for all intents and purposes, everyone forgot about it.
For 200 years, it was nothing. It was just an obscure historical footnote. It wasn't until 1841 that a historian named Alexander Young was republishing these old pilgrim texts.
And he added a footnote of his own.
He did. He added a footnote to Winslow's description of the feast, and in that footnote, he, on his own authority, dubbed it the first Thanksgiving.
So that one historian's footnote is literally the seed of the entire national holiday.
And it falls on very fertile ground. By the mid-19th century, the United States is in the midst of its westward expansion. They're fighting brutal wars against the Plains Indians. They're heading towards the Civil War. They desperately need a unifying, noble origin story.
A story that says, we are good people. We didn't steal this continent through violence. We were invited in. The original inhabitants welcomed us.
It's a stabilizing narrative. If the Indians sat down and ate with us at the very beginning, then the subsequent transfer of power must have been peaceful and consensual. It absolves the nation of the guilt of conquest.
And Abraham Lincoln nationalizes it in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, specifically to foster that sense of unity.
But that unity came at the cost of truth. The myth allows white Americans to feel like they are guests who simply overstayed their welcome, rather than invaders who conquered a continent.
But the Wampanoags never forgot the truth. And this brings us to that crisis in perception moment in the modern era, the story of Frank James.
This is such a powerful moment of historical resistance. So the year is 1970. The state of Massachusetts is planning this huge 350th anniversary celebration of the Pilgrim Landing.
And as part of the celebration, they want to have a good Indian come and give a nice conciliatory speech.
So they invite Frank James, a Wampanoag activist, to speak at their fancy dinner.
But, being careful planners, they ask to see a copy of his speech beforehand.
And when they read it, they panic. Because Frank James didn't write a fluff piece about friendship and harmony. He wrote a speech detailing the plague, the theft of his ancestors' graves, the land fraud, the war, the enslavement, and the continuing poverty of his people.
He wrote the truth.
And the organizers basically said, you can't say that, it's too negative, it ruins the celebratory vibe.
They actually offered to write a new, more positive speech for him.
Just think about that. They tried to put words in his mouth, literally continuing that same colonial dynamic of trying to control and manage the native voice.
So Frank James, being a sovereign man, refused.
He refused to speak at their official dinner. Instead, he went to the statue of Massasoit Usmackin that stands on Coles Hill in Plymouth, overlooking the harbor. He gathered a group of native people from across the country around him.
And he read his original, uncensored speech,
And that was the very first National Day of Mourning.
which continues to this day. Every year on Thanksgiving, while millions of Americans are watching parades and football, the United American Indians of New England gather at that statue. They fast, they don't eat, and they recount the history that the official holiday is designed to hide.
It creates this perfect split screen of American reality. On one channel, you have the myth of the happy feast. On the other channel, you have the memory of the genocide.
And that split screen is the crisis in perception. The entire system of the national myth relies on us only watching the first channel. But books like Silverman's and actions like Frank James's force us to switch channels. They force us to see the infrastructure of the story.
And what's so incredible is that despite all of those systems designed to erase them, the disease, the war, the slavery, the courts, the assimilation policies,
The Wampanoag is still here.
that is the ultimate outcome. The intended outcome of the system was total erasure. The 19th century policymakers fully expected the Indian problem to be solved by the Indians simply vanishing into the great American melting pot.
But you can go to Mashpee today on Cape Cod. You can go to Aquina on Martha's Vineyard. They are there. They have their language reclamation projects. They have their tribal governments.
Silverman quotes a Wampanoag phrase for the experience of losing their land that has really haunted me since I read it. They describe it as falling off our feet.
It's so profound. In their worldview, land isn't just an asset you own, like a stock or a bond. It's the literal ground of your being. It's the thing that holds you up.
So to lose the land is to lose your gravity, your grounding, your entire place in the universe. It is to fall into a void.
And yet somehow, they found a way to stand back up.
Survival itself is resistance. Every Wampanoag child born today is a defiance of the colonial system that was designed from top to bottom to ensure they wouldn't exist.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's try to synthesize this. What does this land, as their land, ultimately teach us about how systems work?
I think it teaches us three really critical lessons. First, that these national myths, they're not just harmless stories, they are institutional infrastructure. The Thanksgiving story is a load-bearing wall that holds up the entire edifice of American innocence.
Right. It's not just decoration, it's structural.
Precisely. Second, that memory and forgetting is a form of system maintenance. By ritually remembering the feast and systematically forgetting the war, we legitimize the current power structure. We make the outcome feel not only inevitable but just.
And the third lesson.
Third, that the Wampanoag story is a masterclass in incentive structures. They were not naive savages who were easily duped by clever Europeans. They were incredibly sophisticated political actors navigating an absolutely impossible situation.
A post-apocalyptic landscape, a biological crisis, a technological shock.
They played the terrible hand they were dealt with, incredible skill for over 50 years. The fact that they eventually lost the war doesn't mean they were simple. It means the systemic forces arrayed against them, disease, demographics, and an insatiable economic hunger for land were, in the end, overwhelming.
It really changes how you look at that fourth Thursday in November. It doesn't mean you can't be grateful or gather with your family.
Of course not. But it means you can't eat the lie.
That's a great way to put it.
You can have the dinner, but you have to serve it with a side of truth. Understand the cost. Understand the full 50-year history that was compressed into that one meal. Once you see the system, you can't unsee it. And that clarity, I think, is what we're always aiming for here.
We want to give full credit to David J. Silverman and his book, This Land is Their Land. It is a dense, incredibly researched, and frankly moving book. We've only scratched the surface of the details here. We highly encourage you to read it to get the full texture of this history, the names, the dates, the specific letters.
Absolutely. It's a foundational book that belongs in every American library. It fundamentally changes the map in your head.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for listening.